Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin, eclectic album reviews and general musical meanderings. I wanted to take a look this week at the album Fractured by Lunatic Soul. And I discovered this album in 2017, actually by discovering Lunatic Soul on a K-Scope sampler that was released that year. And it rose to the top very quickly. I discovered it late in the year, and it still kind of ended up being a top 5 album for me that year. And that was an album that year that had a lot of really great music in it, so that was kind of a feat. But in revisiting it recently, I've been reminded about how distinctive this album is, and how it kind of stands out as an album that maybe has a much more original sound than a lot of other progressive rock influenced projects. Now, Lunatic Soul is a side project of Maurice Duda, and Maurice Duda is the lead singer and bass player for Riverside. And Riverside is a pretty well-established progressive rock band that kind of somewhat fairly sort of gets lumped into this post-2010 Steven Wilson influenced sound that kind of pervades a whole aspect of progressive rock these days, even to the point where some people call Riverside the Polish porcupine tree. And I have a kind of a medium relationship with Riverside. I don't love them, but there's a lot of things that they do that I really like. And Maurice Duda, as the lead singer and bass player in Riverside, has a lot of creative control and creative input in the band. So one must wonder, why break off and have this whole solo project, and not even call it by a solo name, a whole different, band, essentially, a whole different project on the side. And his original intent, I think, with Lunatic Soul was to just explore a whole different aspect of his own musical interest that didn't really fit in the somewhat kind of progressive metal themed music that Riverside generally has done in the past.
Follow my instinct, I'm not afraid to try. Done with your failures you blame me for. I'm moving on.
And Fractured is the 5th album by Lunatic Soul, the project. And my understanding is that Maurice Duda had a very clear idea about what he wanted to accomplish in some ways with the Lunatic Soul project. It's supposed to be like an 8-part project that sort of ruminates on life and death, and there's kind of these interweaving themes that goes from album to album. But from album to album, my understanding is that there's also quite a bit of stylistic variation from one album to the next. I can't speak to that too much because I really have only heard Fractured. But in coming back and revisiting Fractured, I'm really interested in delving back into the Lunatic Soul catalog, because the methods and techniques that Maurice Duda uses to make Lunatic Soul distinctive, I think really pushed him into some creative territory that is worth investigating further. It's a no guitar project. He really wants to stay away from using electric guitar, and that kind of makes sense, especially if he wants to distinguish it from Riverside as a project. Riverside has some kind of sometimes even cliche guitar work going on with their work, but this is an attempt to get away from that. So throughout the Lunatic Soul project in general, he's kind of tries to avoid guitars. Now, I think he cheats a little bit on Fractured. There's a little bit of acoustic guitar here and there, but ultimately the things that you hear that sound like guitar are actually kind of specialty basses, like he'll play piccolo bass, but also expands on the sound of just having those bass lines by lots of like synthetic sounds. So the album is this ongoing mix of like live instruments and live performances and studio created synth work that he really puts together in this really fascinating combination. And to the point where I almost don't think of this album in terms of its production, but instead of in terms of its sound design. He creates a lot of sounds in this album that are really, really distinctive and very unique. He does this by layering things in thoughtful ways. He's not really just taking two different waveforms and combining them, but he's really thinking about taking like the human voice and synthesizer sounds and carefully balancing them and blending them together to make new and different sounds that really shouldn't exist in the real world.
Don't look down, don't hesitate now. Just so you know there's no return, you just hog the limelight.
And also, Maurice Duda coming at this album as a bass player, and also as a bass player trying to avoid like standard guitar tropes, really uses a lot of fascinating melodic content throughout the album that also continues to make it distinctive in its own way. Bass playing as a bass player, you want to think melodically as a bass player. You don't want to just in some cases you'll hammer on one note whenever it's appropriate to do so. But a bass player finds ways to create melodies that play with chord tones and emphasize important notes and bring out other things, but also give the music some sort of melodic definition outside of just the main melody of the piece. And that's happening all over the place on the Lunatic Soul album, this Fractured especially. Yes, there's bass lines. The bass lines are all very, very melodic, and he's doing these really great things with sounds, even within those melodies, and time signatures, making time signatures sound very fluid. But also he's weaving melodies in with synthesizers and with this piccolo bass, and of course his own sung melodies. These melodies are always layering and interweaving with each other. I wouldn't really call it interlocking. That gives it like this sense of being mathematical. And it doesn't feel mathematical. It just feels like these things weave in and out of each other in a very natural way. One of the really defining components of Fractured, I think, is the way that it uses not just a melody, but melodies to create these cool contrapuntal lines. Now, that's not to say that there's not chords on the album, because, there is harmonic complexity that happens, but it's all either implied by these interlocking melodic lines or with really, really subtle and sparse synthesizer pads. And it gives it a really open and ominous sometimes feel, the way that he does it, but it's really very effective, and it again makes it unique and distinctive, not just from Riverside as that project goes, but I think from a lot of progressive rock in general. It's one of the few albums that I can listen to where I can really compare it to like mid-period Peter Gabriel, like Security. It has that same kind of tone, that same kind of dark vibe, and the same sense of like this fight between the organic and the synthetic. In addition to all these interweaving melodies that sort of ripple through these 8 tracks on Fractured, I really also can't say enough about Maurice Duda's melodic sense as a lead singer. He has very, very great sense of melody, and throughout the album, there's just these killer hooks and killer riffs that he sings with a lot of emotion and a lot of sincerity that really propel the songs as overall. I mean, that's the thing that people will listen to more often than not, is with the lead singer singing. What is it that I'm supposed to be singing along with? And it doesn't take you long on this album to figure out what the important part is, what it is you're supposed to be listening to and singing along with. Because Maurice Duda has such a conviction as a lead singer and such a great delivery throughout the album that it's irresistible to follow along with that.
Shadows were trying to get inside, while the vultures were circling the air. The dust has settled and the fear uncovered part of me I couldn't recognize.
Now, one of the things that kind of led me back to listening to Lunatic Soul and Fractured was whenever I kind of finished this recent bout with the Marillion albums, with the Fish era Marillion. And I kind of got to thinking, like, where are the bands that are really doing something that has that level of musical success, creatively speaking. And this is one of the albums I kind of thought about that in regards to. Although this isn't an album that has a band interaction, it's kind of the one thing about it is like it's all just Maurice Duda's coming straight from his head, and he plays almost all the instruments on it, with the exception of like saxophone, some strings, and the drums when they arrive. Everything else is him. So in a way, that's very impressive. But at the same time, sort of miss that sense that there's a collaborative effort between different musicians. That I always find that appealing whenever a band is able to synergize and create something that's more than just their singular parts. But I think that Fractured is an album that kind of rises to that level of artistic success. I don't know that I would say it has the same level of lyric wordplay that Fish had with Marillion, but I do think that the lyrics on this album are definitely worth mentioning. Fractured goes along with this mission statement that Lunatic Soul had early on to explore life and death. And so there are albums in this series, Lunatic Soul series, that are more about death. and more about life. And my understanding is that this is one of the life albums. Actually, you're supposed to be able to tell that by the cover. The covers of all the life albums have these kind of angular patterns on them, and whereas the death albums have more of an organic kind of curves and that look to them. Even though Fracture's talking about death as a topic, it really doesn't come off as particularly morbid. There's definitely a sense of melancholy and definitely a sense of isolation on the album that he's trying to get at and successfully exudes for sure. But it doesn't feel like it's just, overly morose. The lyrics are kind of obtuse enough that they can be interpreted in many ways. For example, like in my opinion, one of the lead tracks in this album is a song called Anymore. And Anymore was a song that was inspired by Maurice Duda's father's passing away. Now, if you listen to this song, you can definitely get that out of it if you know it. But also the lyrics really are more about just being isolated from somebody, having a sense of wanting to connect with somebody and being unable to. And it could be from the perspective of maybe losing a loved one, or maybe just, having somebody that you love that has left you for some reason. It can be listened to and you can connect with it in a variety of different ways, because it doesn't really spell out this is about my dad's death. It's more about like the feelings that he had that were connected to it. So it was more like inspired by the death and about the death. And I think that kind of approach that he has throughout the album makes it a lot more accessible, considering the things that he is pondering as he's making these tracks on the album.
I want to show you my words on paper, but you don't talk to me anymore. Just want to say that I am sorry, but you don't talk to me anymore. I need to show you what I am like, that I've achieved what I have understood. Then you might tell me you're proud of me, but you don't talk to me anymore.
So there's not many opportunities that I have to take an album and favorably compare it to artists like Peter Gabriel and Marillion. And not like he's trying to sound like Peter Gabriel, not that he sounds like Marillion here, but more like it has that level of distinctiveness and creative energy that those artists had at the peak of their powers. So that being said, I think it was probably not a rocket science for you to figure out that I advocate for this album very strongly, especially as I've come back to it recently. I took some time off from it after listening to it, and it really hit me immediately. And every time I've come to it and I've listened to it over the past week or so, it just keeps opening up and I find more and more about it that's worth listening to. It has these great moments where it's just a very clear-cut, almost folk melody, and then there's parts where it almost dissolves into just like these esoteric atmospheres. And it covers all this ground in a way that feels very, very natural. It flows from beginning to end very well. The tracks almost to the point where when you listen to it, it's hard to distinguish one track from the other until you sit down and realize, oh, this is this track. Oh, this is this track. And it could almost be taken as one big piece of music, which makes it a perfect album in many ways. So I love this album very much, and I really want to suggest people to check it out. My next step is this. I don't have any other Lunatic Soul albums beside this one. So I'm kind of torn, because I really would like to go and get Walking on a Flashlight Beam, because the track from that album was the one that actually inspired me to go on and get Fractured. But I just recently found out that Lunatic Soul is about to release a brand new album the next month or so. I didn't even know that going into it. So now I'm kind of torn about which one to proceed with. So if you have any opinions about that, please let me know. But if you haven't heard this one, I think this is for me will be a classic album. It's one that can withstand a deep, deep listen. So check it out if you have the opportunity. I will be coming at you next week with another album. So please make sure you like and subscribe, and perhaps share this one out to your friends. I'll also put a Fractured track over on Spotify, so you can check that out there if you are wanting to see what else I'm listening to this year. We'll see how it fits in the big picture. So until I see you guys then, I'll catch you on the flip side.